Oh, hello. Welcome back to Parley, the series where people like you support the stuff I do by forcing me to talk about very random topics. And this time it's from Lord Rusty. Behold, our discussion topic for today, underpowered game pieces. Oh, yes. I love this entire category of topics so much because as Rusty begins this question, a lot of discussion goes into feature and power creep and why designers make overpowered items, but not a lot goes into why they might make underpowered things. Just to clarify before we begin, I think it's important to frame this discussion as being about things that are, I would say, mostly purposefully underpowered. They weren't made to simply be underpowered. You know, we're going to go on to talk about, like, what are the reasons for doing that. That makes sense. But we're not referring to things that, the developers simply haven't gotten around to buffing, but they clearly would. And personally, I think that's key because it's probably the largest group of underpowered things. Many games with a lot of buildcraft options, maybe not most games, but a lot of the games we're talking about a lot of the time, these are games that have so many pieces that have often had a lot of time to age. The game has often kind of just left them behind. They're clearly not intended to be in any of the categories, and Rusty has created some excellent categories for why something might be deliberately made to be less powerful. They're intended to be more powerful than they are. The developers just don't have infinite time to buff them. So that's kind of something else that we'll get back to later. Okay, so why would you intentionally make something underpowered? I'm going to read the rest of the question now. It's long. We're going to talk about Rusty has created a couple of different categories, actually, which we're going to go through over here. This is only one of them, of different kinds of underpowered game pieces. So that's really cool. I'm going to read through what you wrote, and then we'll go through those. Okay. Rusty says it made a very professional Microsoft Paint picture, which includes some reasons why I think designers might make a game piece underpowered and given some examples. I will do my best to add my own where I can think of them. The categories and examples I've included are as follows. Oh, actually, let's just go through them as they come up. Number 1, making other pieces look good. This category is often taken up by pistols in FPS games, items which will always be swapped out for a better item when one is available, but are generally versatile. I've included the Halo 2 Magnum as an example of a starting weapon, which I think does this badly. This is almost never used in the sandbox, and the Gears of War Snub pistol as an example of a piece that succeeds in this archetype. It's a weapon you'll always want to trade up when you can, but is balanced when used in conjunction with other one-handed pieces of equipment. I've played neither game, but I'll take your word for it. I've also included common item drops in loot-based games in this category. The item pictured is the blue engram from Destiny. Like basically a loot drop, but any common drop table item will inevitably turn into materials once you've progressed past a certain point. That can be put here. Do I want to talk about these as I go? I think I do. So I'm going to stop here and add some stuff of my own. Now, of course, I got to look ahead at the other categories too, so keep that in mind. The making other pieces look good thing. So the way I'm going to add to this parlay, I feel like it's very fun just to go through the discussion you presented. This is one of those parlay, and I get these from time to time where you, the requester, you've done a lot of work and basically made a video, and my job is primarily to just make that video, and that's fun. I like that. What I'm going to add, I like to add an extra condition to these rather than distracting from the cool thing you did. And that extra thing is, I as a game developer, my game designer mind thinks, can we get rid of any of these things? Is there any way that we can do this job of making other game pieces look good? And we're going to talk about that more in a second, what that means. Is there a way we can do that job without making things that are purely underpowered? So for example, when you mention a lot of loot games where weapons drop, the lower rarities are just nothing. They exist only to be upgraded to higher rarities or scrap for materials, or it's just what you start out with. There are games that I think have a pretty healthy relationship to that. A couple games that come to mind are Path of Exile and World of Warcraft. I don't love either game's loot system, but Path of Exile has a lot of interesting mechanics by which you can manipulate an item, and you might want an item of very low rarity that has potential, like good sockets for gems. There are qualities of the item that are really good, seeds of greatness, that you find in the diamond in the rough, because Path of Exile drops you such a ridiculous amount of loot. And that can be really exciting. It can be cool to look through that loot and say, oh, that could be really good if I upgrade a bunch of stuff. Like, that's interesting. That is doing something with having this like mostly bad loot. It's very easy also because of that to get like a sword. If you just need like an example of something, it's very easy to get because the game drops so many items, and you can often upgrade it pretty easily to be a like a reasonable item of that category, which I don't think is so bad. That's not the worst thing in the world. If it fits Path of Exile's lore, I'm not going to talk more about that, but like you're an exile and so you're going to scavenge for goods. Yeah, fine, cool. And then in World of Warcraft, you often get into this cycle where gear is quickly better once it's of a higher level, and so you get into this cycle of churning through, you know, a new item, and then you quickly upgrade it to higher rarities at a similar level. And that creates more of a, you know, the feeling of upgrading your gear is more protracted. It happens more times because there's a larger gradient of items. In that sense, I don't think it's so bad either, because it creates a situation where your items are quickly an upgrade if they're a higher level, even if they're a lower rarity, which is really untrue of a game like Path of Exile. You can get a good item and have it be way lower than your level, and it's still really, really good. World of Warcraft kind of does the opposite, at least when I played it, which was like 10 years ago. And that's interesting in its own way. So I think that's interesting. I think they can occupy an interesting place in an economy. Pistols, I wanted to say something about that. So Titanfall 2 has a loadout system I really like, maybe a topic for some time. The thing you can do is you get 2 weapon slots, and then you get a dedicated pistol slot. You get like a sidearm slot. So these guns are less powerful, but they're competing with less powerful things. So there's room for a less powerful kind of backup weapon. And personally, I think that the shooter feeling, or the trope in firearms or modern combat, where you fire your main weapon, it runs out of ammo, and then you quickly pull out a pistol and empty the clip in all your different weapons. I think that's really cool. And part of that fantasy, in my mind, is that you have to switch to like a weaker but smaller firearm partway through. I don't know why, but something about that is just very cool to me. And maybe this is just me. It is in a lot of media and a lot of games, and I think that giving those things a separate slot, that's a good solution. Apex Legends also does something. I don't know if this is as balanced a solution, like that doesn't make pistols that great. But in Apex Legends, when you have a weapon out, you run slower, but pistols cost you less movement speed. Like, you run slower than if you had no weapon, but not as much slower as if you had another weapon. I don't think this usually means that you should just run around with a pistol in your kit, but a lot of the pistols in Apex Legends are also not half bad. The RE45, the P2020, these are perfectly fine weapons for the player used to them. They have significantly less stopping power, unless you get the P2020 hammer point rounds upgrade. Am I right, folks? Anyway, pretty much my favorite weapon in all of video games as a hammer point P2020. But that's a topic for another time. My point is, I do think there are some ways that you can make these pieces, you know, it's a weapon you just pick up because it's what you have, or you start with it and then you swap off it. Yet they can also fulfill some other need in the game, or in some situations they are really good. Like the Apex Legends thing, they might have an upgrade that you may find as ground loot that suddenly makes them into a very good weapon, if you just like really like pistols, or as a bit of variety to add texture to the game. I really, really don't like the feeling where you just sort of discard a weapon as you go on in most games. The final thing I have to say about this category, though, is that there are some games where I feel like it kind of works. Games where the power scaling, or the scale of combat itself, changes. And so it's appropriate to have, you know, a pistol, a rifle, but then you upgrade to bigger arms, and then maybe you're not even fighting on foot anymore, and you get a vehicle, and then you get an army of vehicles. And you can imagine a game where the scale of combat would increase, such that you kind of discard weapons as they become too small for the conflict that's going on. You're constantly in a situation of bringing a knife to a gunfight, throwing out the knife, and pulling out a rocket launcher, and then that happens to the rocket launcher, so you pull out a tank, and then that happens to the tank, so you pull out a starship. And sure, I can't think of a good example of that, but there are games that have felt that way to me. I don't think that's like bad or anything. Really, the problem is if the lower powered piece is going to be omnipresent, it should really have some role. This isn't quite the same thing. I do kind of want to come back to this later, but one of the biggest examples of this topic, so big I'm not even sure it belongs here, is Magic the Gathering, which is quite famous for having kind of like new player trap cards that are just bad, but they seem good if you haven't played a lot of the game. And I'm very happy that they have kind of phased those out. That is a stupid design decision. You can absolutely do that without making them this way. I actually think Magic arguably doesn't even do that anymore, but it used to do it a lot, like a lot. I would say maybe 15 years ago, Magic was like, you just delete this whole category. It's just Magic the Gathering. Commons in Magic. But nowadays, I don't think it's quite as bad. They tend to find a way to make them, they might appear to be good in one way to a new player, but then they're actually good in a different way to experienced players. And then there might be some occasional corner case where they actually are good in the straightforward way. I think Magic actually does this very well now, but I thought that was an important, somewhat example. Okay. So yeah, making other pieces look good. I think this category can largely be eliminated by very good game design. As we go through, again, my little sub-game is going to be to try to make all of these categories not exist. In other words, you don't actually ever have to have anything be in these categories alone. It can be doing some other work in the game design. And I just explained some reasons how I think you can do that, which is apparently what we're doing for this parlay video, because I thought that was fun. Okay, category number 2. I'm the best at what I do. It's just not very useful. I really love these, by the way, Lord Rusty. This category is for game pieces which do something you might want a little bit of in your build, but perhaps don't need to donate an entire game piece's worth of power budget to doing it at max strength. Examples I've included are Barbara from Genshin Impact, One with Nothing from Magic the Gathering. Those are both fantastic examples. Let's take a look. So I'm going to put us back over here and then... Hey, look at that. That's not bad. Yes, Barbara from Genshin Impact. So Genshin Impact is really tricky for this, because what's happening is that Barbara heals you for a lot. She'll heal your team for enough, but there are kind of a couple of different problems happening at the same time. The first one that's not related to this parlay is that she doesn't really support herself. There's a thing I say in Genshin Impact, like, Barbara is one of the only characters in the game, period, that is meant to support other characters on your team, but she herself requires support. She doesn't generate enough energy by herself, which I think is very bad. Like, if she did something so good that it was worth that, that's one thing. But if she merely heals your team just like other characters can and doesn't do it self-sustainably, that's just very bad. Like, that she arguably doesn't even do anything unless you build around her, and you get no reward for doing so. You get a worse character for more work. But the thing relevant to this parlay is the point that Barbara can heal for more. You know, she can do her big heal and it heals the whole team. It heals players even off the field. That's good. You've got your team of 4. They're swapping in one at a time. Some healers are very effective, but they have the acceptable drawback to balance them, that they only heal the active character. And Barbara heals the whole team, which can be really good. If a character gets really low, you don't want to swap them in to get healing and then they get killed. That's nice. Barbara can also continue to attack with her Melody Loop active, and she'll heal the team for even more. But you just don't need that in Genshin Impact at the moment. There aren't really enough times where you wouldn't have gotten enough healing from another healer or just Barbara only using her burst. So at the moment, it doesn't really feel appropriate. And people came back to this when we had, basically this whole category of game piece is going to be, eventually it'll probably just end up being good in some situation. And we came back to Barbara when we got the Rift Hounds. These guys apply a debuff to you that makes your HP decay over time, and you can't really get rid of it easily. And so having some sustained healing, you can pop in and top yourself off a little bit, is really good. I still don't think Barbara is good for that, but she does do it. She's a character that does the thing. Barbara is also going to be in another category that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, because she is intended to be underpowered for another reason that is very separate from this. But for this category, she's intended to be underpowered overall, but then good if you needed more healing, which you don't yet, because you could argue it opens up design space. There could eventually be a reason that would be good, and that allows the game to have a variety of characters, a larger variety, that are good at different things, which is theoretically good. I don't think this is a good way to do it. I don't think Barbara is a well-designed character, but that in theory, there is a benefit there. One with nothing. What a great example. If you haven't played Magic the Gathering, that's what the three beach ball, volleyball looking things around the old man's head. That's the art from a Magic card called One with Nothing. This is a 1 black mana spell that makes you discard your entire hand. That's really bad. Nearly all of the time. There are some situations where there's like a combo where dumping your hand instantly could, as part of an extremely complicated chain of events, win you the game. But it's one of those cards that you'd open up in a booster pack and think, this is just completely worthless. Like, why would you make this, you know? And it's a good example of what I mentioned before about Magic the Gathering, where there's a lot of game pieces that you feel like you could design this in a way where it would be good for other stuff while also fulfilling this ridiculously specific niche. Like, that effect exists in Magic if you want it, but it's so rare. Like, so few players will want this, you know? I feel like that's just not good. Having it be, I don't know, somehow like a creature with a good stat line, and then this is a drawback. And then you could, but then would it be overpowered in its very limited niche? Anyway, so you can see how that might be an issue, sure. But this card has always frustrated me because it is an example of something that, you know, from a buildcraft perspective, it's cool to have the option. When you find a situation where you want to discard your whole hand, it's exciting when you find out there is a card that does that thing. That's cool. But the fact that it is completely useless in every way, except if you somehow create that situation, that feels, again, it's just very suboptimal game design, I think. It feels like it's hard, it would be challenging, but there's a better version of that. You know, you could make that card, that effect, in a way that was less nonsensical for 99.9% of Magic the Gathering. So I actually really hate this card, but it's an extremely useful and very commonly used example. When you asked this parlay question, I even thought of the card One with Nothing before you even mentioned it. So this is a very good example. I just really hate that card. Gale Kick is in here. Okay, you didn't mention that in the text. Let me see. So Gale Kick is when you do a jump kick, which is when you have a sparring weapon and then you do a slide attack, right? You do this, jump kick thing. Knocks down nearby enemies. You can, I don't even really fully remember how you activate this. We played with this a lot, and even if you maximize for it, I think it's very bad. The question really is, do I think this should be in this category? And the answer is, I don't know. It fills the spirit of something related to being the best at what you do, but it's just not very good. Which is that there isn't another effect that does anything to your jump kick in Warframe, because it wouldn't be good for that to be a thing. There's no niche, there's not even close to a niche for jump kicking enemies. So if you wanted to jump kick enemies, this is the only game in town, is how I often say it. You don't have any other options for boosting that, but Warframe is a game that is designed in such a way we are so far away from there being a reason to jump kick enemies. It just feels like, what's going on here? I don't know. So that's something to consider. What is the piece competing against? And if the piece is not competing against anything, it sometimes feels to the developers like the piece should be very low power, because if you want it, there's no real opportunity cost. If that's the thing that would be good, it doesn't have to beat anything else. So if you make it really powerful, there's maybe a problem where it feels like there's just no choice, but making it underpowered doesn't fix that. I don't know. So this is an egregious example, in my opinion, where it really doesn't need to be underpowered. It doesn't really change that it's the only game in town. Just make it strong and make there be other things that do that thing. Or if there's no good reason to jump kick, you can also still make it strong, because there is no reason to use it anyway. So when a player simply wishes to use that playstyle, you can make it powerful. Anyway, I bad design, bad design. No, drop it. Put it down. Slap that out of the developer's hand and tell them to come back with something better. But interesting, exciting to a player like me. I like seeing that they have that design space on their radar, you know? Anyway, moving on to the third category. Rusty is calling this one training wheels. This category is for game pieces which are useful to a new player, but ultimately not powerful at a competitive level, whatever that means for the game. I've given Garen from League of Legends and Barbara again from Genshin Impact as examples. You'd also include most default assault rifles in FPS games, but nothing in particular stood out to me. Yes, so this is a pretty interesting one. There are, I think for this category in particular, like a lot of different kinds of reasons that something might be here. I'm going to start with Barbara first, since I mentioned her earlier. In Genshin Impact, you're given a basic set of characters at the beginning of the game. These let you fill out a team, 4 characters in your Genshin Impact team, and they also kind of fill out the elements so that you can interact with the world. When you need to apply hydro or pyro or electro to something, you have a character when you start playing on your account that can apply that element to the environment, which is pretty important, meaning that you don't need to randomly get a character that has that element to be able to even interact with those parts of the game. That would make the game sort of borderline unplayable. And so they've included a basic set of characters like that. Now, obviously, they have a financial incentive, since you buy other characters, to make those characters at least feel very weak. The interesting thing is that, except for Barbara, I really don't think they do. So Amber aside, Kaya and Lisa, 2 of the other characters you get, are fairly straightforwardly useful. They're at least not particularly bad, and they have their own niches where they can be quite powerful. That's kind of a topic for another time, but the thing about Barbara is that she feels intended to be deliberately really weak in an uncomplicated way, unlike those other characters, in my opinion. I feel like for Amber, Kaya, and Lisa, and Xiangling is not bad in any way, but the other starters you get are either they're literally just a good character, or the developers found some complicated way to make them be very worthwhile eventually, or in some situations, whereas Barbara feels like the one where they really hit you over the head with she's just bad. Not always, as we talked about before, but it feels much more glaring to me, to a lot of other people. It is ultimately a subjective thing. But yeah, so that's one where training wheels is a deceptive name there. She's there to help the game function, but the real reason for Barbara to be underpowered in this way, in this category, is a financial incentive, which I think is also pretty common. There are a lot of games where, that you have something that does the job, but you then want something better. Not a very good reason to make something underpowered. Genshin Impact itself proves that these characters do not need to be just weak, period. You can make them good at something else. Barbara is a really odd part of the game in that way. Garen, you said competitive earlier. I think this gets to be a complicated one. Really, I would combine this with the next category, which we'll talk about in just a minute, where there's going to be characters that have a low skill floor. In other words, they're very easy to play at a decent functional level, but also a low skill ceiling. In a competitive game, like a game where you fight other players that are also choosing characters with some kind of skill floor and some kind of skill ceiling, this is very complicated. In fact, I think this is probably too large a topic for this parlay, but the general idea is that, if a character is really accessible, that has a sort of unsolvable value for game design. If Garen is really easy to get most of the value out of, how good is that? What in practice, what objective value does that have? If things hit the wall, you don't have to do anything complicated to get the value out of him. So theoretically, even an experienced player may reap some tactical benefit from that. Being a simple character doesn't just mean you're an easy character. There is some kind of tactical benefit to that in most games. But there's also something to be said for a character that simply has complicated inputs, but does something very powerful. Here's an example I'll give. What if you had a fighting game, there probably are fighting games like this, where some characters simply didn't have any combos they could perform, so performing them at their highest level, playing them at their max power, is much easier physically. In exchange, their abilities became a bit stronger. Well, this would be a problem because for unskilled players, those characters would just be the best period all of the time because nobody would be doing combos. And at higher levels, the character would be worthless garbage because if you can just do the combo, then they're outclassed by every character in the game. So it's pretty awkward. I think that in a game like League of Legends specifically, it's kind of interesting because League is a game that really plays into that. I said, there could be a tactical benefit to a character being simple. If you're not distracted by some other aspect of the game and you can like last hit minions for gold and stuff like that, that does do something to objectively strengthen a character that is a bit more straightforward. Now, Garen is a pretty extreme example who my understanding is pretty unviable, but League of Legends balance is a whole mess onto itself. I think this topic is complicated. I think it's related to that Magic the Gathering thing. I think a lot of the time you can find a way for the character to be good in a different context later on, but it really depends. I think this is one where the specific game mechanics make the biggest difference. How meaningful is it for a character to just be simple? One other quick example, we talked about Magic the Gathering a bit. In Magic, there's often this idea that, you look at a format, you look at the cards available, and you're thinking, okay, here's a bunch of really good strategies that have legs, but which one do I pick? If they all feel kind of equal to me, what do? And a common piece of advice is that you should pick the aggressive strategy, because if everybody is just asking questions and providing answers, interacting with each other and trading abilities and mind gaming and doing footsies and stuff or whatever it is in whatever game. The idea is that, like, if you have all the answers, but you have no questions, you cannot win. You won't lose, but you won't be doing anything that will kill your opponent. So if you just throw a bunch of questions at them, a bunch of offensive stuff, eventually your opponent may fail to find an answer and then you will win. Like, they'll die. Whereas if you have a bunch of answers, yeah, like, you're going to be able to handle a lot of what comes at you, but your win state, like when they have a question and you have an answer, you don't win, you just don't lose. So that doesn't mean that aggressive strategies are always better, but there's a very good reason that a controlling strategy in Magic, at least, and in a lot of games, has to be pretty powerful to win. There has to be a reason why it's worth it for you to stall the opposition out. That is a complicated and interesting aspect of buildcraft theory in a competitive game like a PvP game, in my mind. I'm not sure it's entirely in this training wheels category, but the idea that you could make a straightforward character that is easy to play, but that like really is good. There are games designed in a way where that just kind of happens, and I think Magic is one of them. Playing a mono red aggro deck doesn't require no skill. I'm very frustrated whenever I hear that. If you've played a deck like that before, it does require some finesse. But the finesse of playing chicken, you don't have to do a lot of complicated things, but there's going to be one moment in the game where you need to make a big balls decision, and if you fail, you're going to die. And I like that. It's fun. Like, some red deck wins, why not? Anyway, a really interesting topic, but I think you can agree a bit separate from the rest of this parlay. Topic number 4. This is the excuse me, my skill ceiling is up here category. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I kind of talked about it in the previous category and I don't have a lot to say. Rusty says, this is the opposite category to training wheels, a game piece that's so powerful in the hands of a skilled player, it can never be allowed to be strung to anyone except the best players in the world. This category normally only applies to games with something like an esports scene, such as like Age of Empires or League of Legends. I've chosen Azir to represent this category in League of Legends, a character who's a bit of a noob trap but very strong in competitive play. Oftentimes, these characters require like an unreasonable amount of micro. You need to manage way too many different things, but in theory, or like a computer playing this character would be really good, but humans are not very good at it. I can actually give you a whole example of a game for this category. Legion TD2 is a really good example of a tower defense game where the type of calculation you're making I think the game is fun because it's a type of calculation that humans are just awful at. Like, we're so bad at that game, which is why it's interesting, because we don't have the calculation speed to ever really know what would be good. So we sort of have to make an educated guess, which I love. Some of you folks know, I think that it's kind of bad game design if you actually have to do the math for any of these things. And Legion TD2 is a game all about making it so impossible to do the math that you just have to guess, which is really fun and creates these interesting little micro build decisions. I don't have a whole lot else to say about this. Again, I think it contrasts the previous category, like you mentioned. Category number 6, it's just a meme, bro. Oh wait, I skipped one. Help, I'm in the wrong game. Category number 5. This category is for pieces which do an effect that should be strong, but could be dialed incredibly high and not be useful just because of the confines of the game the piece is in. I've chosen Nyx from Warframe and Tachanka from Rainbow Six Siege. Nyx, of course, being here as a mind control frame in a game where AI companions are worthless, and Tachanka being a character whose entire power set is based around becoming stationary in a game all about fast movement. Oh, I haven't played Rainbow Six Siege, but I have actually heard of this character. This is pretty often referred to as an example of this topic. You're picking really good examples. I knew some of these either even without playing the game or before I even read the Parley thing. Gotta say, some very, very strong examples in this Parley so far. Whoops. Let me go back over here. Yes, a couple examples. Right, Nyx is the one I'll dig into a little. This is one where, I said that I want to look at how you can eliminate these categories. And for the first few, for making other pieces look good, and I'm the best at what I do, it's just not very useful. There's some like design space related reasons why that thing maybe could be underpowered overall, but you can also make it so it has some purpose elsewhere. And then the training wheels and skill ceiling categories, I was arguing it's much more about the game they're in. That's sort of a whole topic unto itself. This category is one where the solution is the developers kind of just made a mistake ever designing this character in the first place, and they did that because of design space. They probably wanted there to be more of a variety of characters, and in doing so they went a little too far and didn't think critically enough about whether this effect is appropriate for this game. These are characters that are not even necessarily underpowered, they're just not appropriate designs for the game they're in wholesale. It doesn't make any sense to have a character with a single target mind control ability in Warframe. That's just not a good idea if you're developing something for Warframe. It's cool. It's a cool concept. Nyx has other abilities that I don't think are like a bad way to manifest the mind controlling thing. And to be fair, I do think Nyx, like every other frame, is in a perfectly good place in Warframe right now, but mind control will really never be a good ability on its own in Warframe. Warframe is designed in every possible way to make sure that mind control is terrible. Enemies do very low damage to themselves. Their damage is balanced for the player, who has much lower health. That design decision itself makes math all funky for controlling enemies to fight other enemies. Enemies are very tanky. They have powerful defensive measures that other enemies don't have any way to remove most of the time. So like their damage reduction alone is already enough to stop most enemy attacks. Warframe is a horde shooter, so removing one enemy from a fight just does like pretty much nothing for the numbers of that fight. The action economy, to use a D&D term, is just meaninglessly high against having one controlled companion. It doesn't really make a meaningful difference if there are 10 enemies and you stop one of them. That sounds good. You fully stop one enemy with one button. That sounds good. But because Warframe has so many enemies, that's pretty much meaningless. We have done some work in the past to try to make mind control be really good, and I think it's a testament to just how hilariously inappropriate for Warframe that ability is, how much we did to try to make mind control good, and it became like, okay. Like it was like sort of able to kill enemies sometimes if you do everything in your power as a player of Warframe to make that unit strong. And we did some truly ludicrous things, and even then the enemy becomes like a weaker specter. It's miserable. Again, this is a category where the game design solution isn't to buff them, it's that these just should not be characters in the game at all. I do actually think that there's a solution in Warframe for mind control, and it would really be to totally overhaul it, and reworking Nyx in a different way isn't the topic of this Parley video. But yeah, like letting the player directly control the mind controlled enemy and use your weapons and mods and stuff like that could be kind of interesting. There's some potential there. They'd be complicated to code. But there could be a way that controlling one enemy could be really good. You could buff them in some ways. I don't know. But anyway, moving on. The next category is, so now we're getting into the silly ones. Number 6, it's just a meme, bro. This is a category for game pieces which were intentionally made to be funny or became memes and are therefore unable to receive buffs as it would ruin the joke. I'm going to have some quibbles about this one. Tachanka's back as another example, as well as the Stug and Gale kick from Warframe. Tachanka and Slugger game pieces the devs have resisted buffing as the community enjoys their meme status as underpowered options, and Gale kicks here is an item that was clearly put in as a joke. See, this is the one, I'm going to sit down. This is going to be the category where I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I think that that's highly debatable. I mean, of course it's highly debatable, but I would suggest that from a game design perspective, there really isn't a reason that those things have to be that way. There could be some incredibly well hidden way that the thing is really good without making the thing completely useless at all times. And I do also think that the cost to these types of things is far higher than the developers and the players seem to understand. Most players of most games do not get the joke, which means that when they see this underpowered game piece, they're just really confused. They don't think it's fun or funny or good. It makes them, it kind of breaks a promise the game is making that things won't be pointless, that the game isn't mocking your efforts to make something be good. I don't think it's bad for one weapon out of Warframe's multitudes to just be a bit silly. I don't, if you want to word it this way, dislike the meme, you know? But I do still feel like there's not really a good reason not to make the thing powerful in some way, or at least have some niche. And then if they want to make it be a bit silly, you can do that without making the thing just be useless. In Warframe, you could look at peculiar mods, for example. I don't know. I also think that Gale Kick, I really disagree with you that there is a good reason to believe it was put in as a joke. There are a lot of mods in Warframe of a similar power level, terrible, that don't seem to have been put in as a joke. They just didn't really put effort into balancing them. I think that the idea that Gale Kick is a joke requires a game that is normally well balanced, and Warframe isn't that game. So I personally think that's, to be blunt, clearly not the case. It's just badly balanced. It's not meant to be weak. They just didn't really balance it. That's just a big problem with Warframe. I don't think that could be true of a lot of other games, don't get me wrong. But I do think Gale Kick is an exception there. Really, I think the other thing about the meme status thing is there can be characters that are like that can still be good in some ways. I've thought of characters in the past that have a very ridiculous way of doing things, but can still be kind of fun because they are good at the thing they're doing. It's just so weird. Sometimes this even gets a little bit out of control. I think of there's that one League of Legends character that basically just like locks on to another ally and is that ally. You don't even like move when you play them. Yumi, I think. Is it Yumi? I haven't played League of Legends in like 10 years, so give me a break. That it maybe wasn't a joke character originally, but the point is like that's a kind of a meme or silly playstyle that became kind of overpowered, you might argue. There's also I had another example. Wisp in Dota, the original Dota, or maybe there's Wisp in Dota 2, was basically like a ball and chain. You'd attach yourself to another player and then kind of swing around them, which looked silly, but it was good when played the right way. And your ultimate like you exploded and killed yourself and did a bunch of damage. It was silly from a gameplay perspective, but not bad, just like clearly a bit ridiculous. You had to sort of be taking the piss out of yourself to play them. So I don't know, maybe I'm just a spoilsport, but I would challenge the necessity of just the meme game pieces actually being weak. I don't think they actually have to be bad. In some cases they're good. They feel powerful. If you play them, you feel powerful some of the time, but then you're like from a statistical or a tactical perspective, you're just overall terrible. Like I bet this Tachanka character, in Rainbow Six is very powerful when they're doing their thing, and you probably get to do their thing some of the time, but then you just get wasted by someone coming at you from behind. Maybe that's okay. I'd kind of question whether that is underpowered in a way. Obviously, in a competitive setting, that changes. But I don't know. I think this category is tricky in that regard. And finally, we have voltage sequence. Given everything we've discussed about underpowered game pieces, what reason does this mod have to exist? And how do we categorize it in the larger design space of bad game pieces? Ah, yes, voltage sequence. For some reason, I have been cursed by the high heavens to talk about voltage sequence until the end of time. And for that reason, I will not be extending this little sidebar so that the mod will fit in the frame, because it doesn't matter. Let's have a discussion about voltage sequence, because the elephant in the room here is that all of this discussion about game design and game balance necessitates that we assume that the developers are good at balancing things, that they do and are good at balancing things. And Warframe's developers are not. They just aren't. There's way too many things in Warframe that it's not really that hard to make them balance much better if you played the game a lot, but the developers just don't do a very good job with that. This is okay. This doesn't make them fools. They might not have enough time or the right workflow or the right people doing the balancing. They are, in some ways, I think, getting better at this, and it just takes a while to turn a company to do a thing like that better, sometimes many years, as it has for Warframe. And so I'm not trying to say that this makes them idiots or something. Let's have some respect for the fact that this is a challenging thing. That being said, I think Warframe is a very bad example for this type of topic, because the answer is they just don't know how to balance these kinds of effects. The right workflow to balance something like this just isn't in place. We're not there at the company. We can never know why, like what is wrong. It's not really useful to give any more advice than, hey, you are not doing a good job with this. You're leaving a lot of low-hanging fruit rotting on the vine. You should fix that. And I think they just know that already and are trying in whatever way they can to do that. So I'm not sure that's very meaningful, but for the purpose of discussion, all right, let's talk about voltage sequence a little bit, okay? This is a mod for the Lanka that says, I'm going to read it because I'm not going to put the whole thing on the screen. Killing a flying enemy creates a lightning trap from their remains, lasting 8 seconds, and then it gives you the sequence effect. Let's break this down. If you haven't played Warframe, the Lanka is a sniper rifle, which means you have to scope in pretty far a lot of the time, and the Lanka has travel time. Hitting a flying enemy with a sniper rifle that has travel time is already enough of a reason for this to be bad a lot of the time in a fast-paced game like Warframe. Killing one enemy with a sniper rifle and a flying enemy, so you probably won't kill multiple at once. The Lanka has punch through, but the enemy is flying, so there's probably not more enemies behind it, is already bad. Like, that's just bad no matter. It doesn't even really matter, unless what this did was kill everything in a huge radius. When you did this, that just already is bad. So what does it do? Does it kill everything in a huge radius? I guess that would be good. What does it do? Well, it makes a lightning trap. For whatever reason, the lightning trap has hilariously low range. It's like 2 meters or something. It's like almost impossible for this to affect anything, ever, anywhere. The sequence effect, we're not going to get into because it's very replaceable. You could easily get that a variety of other ways. It's not very unique. Occasionally it will do a burst of damage, a status effect, and some restoration, but it's not really relevant to this discussion. Why does this exist? Let's break down the design problems here. Well, it exists to create design space. It's a very unique game piece. That's theoretically good. It does something really unique. It does something that you wouldn't get anywhere else. It counters a very specific kind of enemy in a game that has a lot of loadout space. You can bring a weapon that only counters one specific kind of enemy. That's a thing it's not very costly to do that in Warframe sometimes. So in theory, a weapon that like counters flying enemies or gives you a payoff against flying enemies, that might be kind of good. What are the problems? Well, the effect is just very weak, but it doesn't stop there. It doesn't actually counter flying enemies. It rewards you for killing flying enemies, but not in a way that counters flying enemies specifically. So there aren't that many flying enemies in Warframe a lot of the time. So there have to be flying enemies. In practice, basically you're fighting Corpus or maybe Infested. There'll be flying enemies, Orican, not Grineer, basically. And then you need to shoot them with this, already not great. And then they have to die to this, okay? And then what you get doesn't really play into that. You're not really countering flying enemies. It would be against those factions, I suppose. It could counter those factions if the effect was good at something. But it's kind of confused from a design space perspective. It's giving you a general benefit, I guess. It doesn't specifically address flying enemies, but only in a specific situation. What about a specific effect in a general situation? That would make it apply a lot more often, or it would feel like it would. So there's a lot of problems here. Again, I feel like from a design space perspective, it kind of makes sense, like having the weapon do something really unique. But why on the Lanka? Why these effects? Why is it so weak? Would anybody who's ever played Warframe ever even wonder whether 2 meters was enough, or however big the radius is? I don't know, but it's small, okay? You would know without testing that that was too small. And this is really the recurring problem in Warframe. Many of the values that are too low, like, it's not that they're like kind of close, but they're just too weak. They're like not even remotely congruent with the game that they're being put in. It feels like anyone who had ever played Warframe before would be able to just guess a much better value than that. And so it begs the question, like, what's happening? Like, I get why it begs discussion, you know, how it's not a small mistake. It's like someone who hasn't even played Warframe is putting these things in. And then there are many other things that seem to demonstrate this understanding. And so how is that happening? How is this mod in a game where a good amount of the time the people making the mods do understand this stuff? How is that possible? It just seems like a logical contradiction. I don't know. We can't know. But the main thing I want to talk about with this effect is that I think it's a really great thing to have in the game if you have the kind of developer that will go back and collect the low-hanging fruit. Those fruits rotting on the vine, you can still crush them into jam. And this type of effect is kind of great in the one sense that it's very easy to buff. All they have to do is someone on their coffee break has to go into the code and edit the amount of range the lightning trap has. And suddenly, you know, it's a little more than that, okay? But just as an example, and suddenly this effect could wake up. So I don't know. I find it hard to hate this kind of effect. It's just so ridiculous. Like, again, it really feels like alien, like it was put in the game before it was like finished or something. That might even be what happened. It's very strange. Again, circling all the way back to the beginning of this parlay, the primary reason why there are underpowered game pieces is the developers not having the time, resources, or workflow to make them powerful like they should be. When we're at this end one, the answer is there isn't a reason it should be underpowered. It just should be more powerful, and the developers either don't know how to balance it or don't have time to balance it. There isn't a reason it's underpowered. It's not really meant to be. Whereas all these other categories were about things that are intentionally underpowered for some or other perceived or actual benefit, which I think is an interesting distinction. This was long. I am really interested in talking more about that other topic. I kind of feel like it's something else. I'd like to conclude, though. There's a few things I want to say. So the whole thing about like the underpowered pieces. Something that is very related to this subject is the idea of things being, balance not really mattering because of power fantasy. That came up in a previous similar parlay. And I wanted to highlight it here because talking about underpowered game pieces really highlights how silly that idea is. Why is it helping power fantasy for some things to be underpowered? Why not just make them be stronger? Why not just buff them a lot? But it's important to remember that they are fulfilling other game design pieces. So making them powerful in some but not all ways, not just buffing everything, does have clear gameplay utility. Among these 7 categories, well, I don't know if voltage sequence counts, but the other 6 categories, I'm sure there's one of those things that you think, yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable reason for something to be less powerful. And if you thought that, that means that it is not simple enough to just buff everything. There are reasons for things to be more or less powerful, even if the reason is that the thing actually isn't less powerful than the other stuff it's competing against, like my original example of Titanfall 2 and a dedicated pistol slot. Pistols are underpowered, but they're only competing for the space that you have for them with other weapons of the same power level. So that's okay. You can have weapons that are of different strengths because they get their own space to compete among like individuals. That's okay. So it doesn't mean that different power levels are inappropriate or even incongruent with a power fantasy game. That is not how power fantasy works. The goal is to have there be meaningful choices so you can have the fantasy of being powerful, a way that you feel is powerful, not the one way that happens to be overpowered in the game. That doesn't make sense. That isn't how game design works for people not making a game for an individual. If you're making a game for a lot of people and they're not all going to like the same thing, there are choices. They should be balanced. But that doesn't mean that they all need to be balanced the same way. I thought this was a cool example of that. I just want to say, Rusty, you had really, really good examples. I know I said that earlier. I just thought, like, particularly good examples. That was awesome. Thanks for asking. I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your support. Wouldn't be able to do it without you.